Two empires, two legends, one question that historians have been arguing about for 2,000 years. And here's the thing. Rome, the most powerful military machine in human history, once looked at Greece and said, "We want everything you have. The language, the gods, the philosophy, the art." Rome literally stole an entire civilization and then built something even larger on top of it. So the question isn't just who was more powerful. The question is, can you be more powerful than the civilization that created you? Let's find out. Most people think this is a simple question. Rome had bigger armies. Rome had better roads. Rome lasted longer. Case closed. But that answer is lazy. And it misses the most important point entirely. Because power is not just about armies. Power is about ideas. Power is about systems. Power is about how deeply a civilization reaches into the future. And by that measure, this comparison becomes one of the most fascinating puzzles in all of human history. Here is what nobody tells you. When Roman soldiers marched into Greece in 146 BC and conquered it completely, burning cities, enslaving populations, looting temples, something extraordinary happened. The conquered began to conquer the conquerors. The Roman poet Horace wrote it himself, in Latin, using a Greek literary form. Graecia capta ferum victorum cepit. Capture Greece captured its savage captor. A civilization that had been militarily defeated was simultaneously winning on every other front that mattered. How does that happen? How does a defeated nation win? That's what this video is really about. To understand it, we have to go back, all the way back, to a rocky, sun-baked peninsula in the Mediterranean around 800 BC, where something completely unprecedented was beginning. Greece was not an empire in the way Rome was. It was never a single unified state with one ruler and one army. It was a collection of fiercely independent city-states, polis, each with its own government, its own currency, its own army, its own identity. Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Argos. These were not provinces of a larger nation. They were sovereign entities that happened to share a language and a set of gods. They fought each other as often as they cooperated. They were, in many ways, more like modern European nations than like provinces of an empire. And yet, from this chaotic, fractious, constantly at war collection of city-states came something the world had never seen before. Democracy, philosophy, mathematics, theater, the Olympic Games, the concept of the individual citizen with rights, the idea that the universe operates according to laws that human reason can understand. These were not small contributions. These were the foundations of everything that came after. Every legal system in the Western world traces back to Greek thought. Every university in the world teaches in a tradition that begins in Athens. Every time a politician uses the word democracy, they're speaking Greek. How did a collection of small, frequently warring city-states produce this? The answer is competition. The same force that made them constantly fight each other also made them constantly innovate. Athens couldn't afford to be intellectually inferior to Corinth. Sparta couldn't afford to be militarily inferior to Athens. The competition was existential. An existential competition, when it doesn't destroy you, produces genius. Sparta understood this perfectly, and Sparta's contribution to this story is something most people completely underestimate. When most people think of Sparta, they think of 300 warriors at Thermopylae. Muscles, spears, and the phrase "come and take them." But Sparta was something far more sophisticated than a warrior cult. Sparta was the world's first documented experiment in total social engineering, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. The Spartan system began at birth. Every newborn was examined by a council of elders. If the child appeared weak or deformed, it was taken to a cliff called the Apothetai and left to die. This was not cruelty for its own sake. This was a calculated investment in collective survival. Only the strongest genes would persist in the Spartan population. It sounds monstrous by modern standards. By ancient standards, it was rational policy. If the child survived inspection, the real process began. At age 7 years old, Spartan boys were taken from their families and entered the Agoge. The Agoge was not a school in any recognizable sense. It was a total immersion program designed to produce one thing: the perfect soldier. Boys slept on reed beds. They cut themselves with their bare hands from the Eurotas River. They were given insufficient food, deliberately, to teach them to endure hunger and to develop the cunning to steal more. If a boy was caught stealing, he was punished. Not for stealing, but for being caught. The lesson was clear. Resourcefulness was a virtue. Getting caught was a failure. They trained in the sun and the cold. They were beaten to teach them to endure pain without sound. They were sent into the wilderness alone for months in a program called the Cryptia, where they had to survive entirely by themselves, and, horrifyingly, were expected to kill helot slaves they encountered, both as a practical exercise in violence and as a mechanism of social control over the enslaved population. This was systematic brutality elevated to state policy, and it produced warriors of a quality that the ancient world never surpassed. At 18, Spartan boys became soldiers. At 20, they entered the active military. They lived in military barracks, ate communal meals, slept away from their wives even after marriage, until age 30. 30 years old was when a Spartan man was finally permitted to live in his own home. He remained on military reserve until 60. His entire life, from birth to old age, belonged to Sparta. The result? At the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC, 300 Spartan warriors held the entire Persian army, estimated at between 100,000 and 300,000 men, for 3 days in a narrow mountain pass. They died to the last man, but they bought enough time for the Greek alliance to regroup and ultimately defeat Persia at the battles of Salamis and Plataea. 300 men against 300,000. 3 days. The ratio is so extreme, it sounds fictional. It wasn't. And that military culture, that absolute willingness to die in total silence, without complaint, in service of the collective, was something Rome studied and admired and never quite replicated. While Sparta was building the perfect warrior, Athens was building the perfect thinker. And these two projects, running simultaneously in the same small country, created a civilizational tension that produced extraordinary things. Athens, under Pericles in the 5th century BC, was something the world had genuinely never seen. A city of perhaps 300,000 people, tiny by modern standards, that was simultaneously producing Sophocles, Euripides, Aristophanes, Socrates, Plato, Thucydides, Herodotus, Phidias, and the Parthenon, all at the same time, in the same generation, in a city you could walk across in an hour. The density of genius in 5th century Athens is statistically almost impossible to explain. It has never been matched in any city since. The theater alone is extraordinary. Athenian drama was not entertainment in the modern sense. It was civic ritual. Attending the theater was a democratic act. During the festival of Dionysus, the entire citizen population of Athens would gather in the theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Acropolis. 10,000, 15,000 people sitting on stone seats in the open air from dawn to dusk, watching tragedies and comedies that explored questions of justice, power, fate, and a relationship between humans and gods. Sophocles wrote about a man who kills his father and marries his mother, and turned it into a meditation on the nature of knowledge and blindness that Sigmund Freud was still analyzing 2,500 years later. This was not primitive storytelling. This was philosophy in dramatic form, delivered to the entire population at once. Meanwhile, in a colonnaded walkway called the Stoa Poikile, a man named Zeno was developing a philosophy called Stoicism, the idea that virtue is the only true good, that external circumstances cannot destroy internal freedom, that the wise man remains calm in the face of any disaster. This philosophy, born in Athens, spread through the Greek world, reached Rome, and became the governing philosophy of the Roman Empire's greatest emperors. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who governed 100 million people and commanded the largest military force on earth, wrote his personal journals in Greek. In Stoic Greek, the intellectual framework of the most powerful man in the world came from a man standing in a painted walkway in Athens 400 years earlier. The reach of Greek intellectual culture across time is almost impossible to comprehend. And then there was Alexander. If Greece was a fire, Alexander was the moment it became a conflagration that consumed the known world. Alexander the Great of Macedon is the most remarkable individual in the history of warfare. At the age of 20, he inherited a kingdom. At 22, he crossed into Asia with 47,000 men and began a campaign that would not end for 13 years. In those 13 years, he never lost a battle. Not once. He defeated the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever known, in 3 decisive engagements. He marched his army through modern-day Turkey, Syria, Egypt, Israel, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, ending in northern India where his exhausted troops finally refused to go further. At the time of his death at 32, possibly from typhoid fever, possibly from poisoning, possibly from drinking himself to death after the death of his closest companion Hephaestion, Alexander had personally conquered over 2 million square miles of territory. He had founded over 20 cities, all named Alexandria, the greatest of which in Egypt became the intellectual capital of the ancient world for 300 years. But here is what makes Alexander truly extraordinary and what separates Greek power from Roman power in the most fundamental way. Alexander did not merely conquer. He spread. Everywhere his army went, Greek language, Greek philosophy, Greek theater, Greek architecture, Greek mathematics followed. The period after Alexander's death is called the Hellenistic Age, from Hellas, the Greek word for Greece, and it represents a 300-year period during which Greek culture was the dominant culture from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. You could travel from Alexandria in Egypt to Bactria in modern Afghanistan and conduct your entire life in Greek. You could find Greek theaters, Greek gymnasiums, Greek temples, Greek philosophical schools across an area that modern airlines take 6 hours to cross. This is a different kind of power than military conquest. This is cultural power, mimetic power, the power of ideas that replicate themselves across time and space, outlasting any army, any wall, any empire. When the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age in 9th century Baghdad were translating ancient texts and preserving the knowledge that would eventually spark the European Renaissance, the texts they were translating were primarily Greek. When the European Renaissance began in 14th century Florence and produced Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Galileo, the intellectual tradition they were reviving was Greek. When the American founding fathers designed a republic with a Senate, with democratic principles, with the separation of powers, they were explicitly and consciously imitating Greek and Roman models. But those Roman models were themselves imitations of Greek originals. The chain is unbroken. From Socrates in 400 BC to Thomas Jefferson in 1776 is an uninterrupted thread of Greek thought. Now let's talk about Rome, because Rome deserves its due, and its due is enormous. Rome began as a small city on 7 hills beside the Tiber River in central Italy. According to Roman tradition, it was founded in 753 BC by twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who had been raised by a wolf. The wolf part is legend. The founding date is approximately correct. What is certainly true is that for its first several centuries, Rome was a minor regional power in a peninsula dominated by other, more sophisticated peoples. The Etruscans to the north, the Greek colonies to the south, the Samnites in the mountains. Rome was not born great. Rome became great through a process so systematic and so relentless that it remains the most remarkable story of institutional development in the ancient world. The Roman Republic, the governmental system that preceded the empire, was a masterpiece of political engineering. 2 consuls elected annually shared executive power, each with the ability to veto the other. The Senate, a body of 300 experienced statesmen, provided continuity and wisdom. Tribunes of the plebs could veto any senatorial decision that threatened the interests of common citizens. Censors maintained the citizen roles and public morality. Praetors administered justice. Quaestors managed finances. Every position had defined powers and defined limits. Every position was temporary. Every position was subject to accountability. This was not democracy in the Greek sense. Only property-owning adult male citizens could vote, and the votes of the wealthy counted for more. But it was a system of distributed power with checks and balances that was genuinely innovative and genuinely durable. The Roman Republic lasted from 509 BC to 27 BC, 482 years. The United States has existed for 250 years. The Roman Republic was twice as old. What the Roman Republic built, above all else, was a military system of extraordinary sophistication. The Roman legion was the most effective fighting force in the ancient world. Not because Roman soldiers were individually superior. Spartan warriors were probably better individual fighters. Not because Rome had better generals. Greece produced Alexander, the greatest general in history. But because the Roman legion was a system. A modular, adaptable, self-sustaining system that could operate effectively in almost any terrain, against almost any enemy, under almost any circumstances. A standard Roman legion consisted of roughly 5,000 to 6,000 men, organized into cohorts of 600, which were further divided into centuries of 80 men each. Each century was commanded by a centurion, a professional career soldier who was the backbone of the entire Roman military. The centurion was not an aristocrat. He was not appointed by birth or wealth. He was promoted from the ranks based entirely on demonstrated ability, courage, and leadership. In a world where almost all military command was aristocratic, this was revolutionary. The best soldier became the commander. The system found and promoted talent regardless of origin. The legion could build a fortified camp in hours. Marching through hostile territory, Roman soldiers would stop at the end of each day's march, dig a ditch, construct an earthen rampart, and erect a wooden palisade, a fully defensible military base built in a single afternoon, every afternoon, as a matter of routine. Inside the camp, the layout was always identical. The same streets, the same positions for tents, the same locations for headquarters, latrines, medical facilities. Every soldier in every legion knew exactly where everything was. If you were wounded and transferred to a different legion, you would still know where to find a hospital. This standardization was not bureaucratic pedantry. It was the elimination of confusion under life or death conditions. The Roman road system was the physical expression of this same logic. At its maximum extent, the Roman Empire contained over 400,000 kilometers of roads, 80,000 of which were paved with stone. These roads were not merely transportation infrastructure. They were military infrastructure. A Roman legion could march 40 kilometers per day on a Roman road. The same journey on unpaved terrain might take 3 times as long and arrive with soldiers too exhausted to fight. Roman roads allowed the empire to concentrate military force faster than any enemy could anticipate. When a province rebelled on the northern frontier, legions from Spain could be on their way within days. The empire functioned as a single military organism because its roads made communication and movement so fast. Modern archaeologists have found Roman roads still in use, still being walked on, still structurally sound, 2,000 years after they were built. The engineering was not temporary convenience. It was permanent infrastructure designed to last forever. The Roman aqueduct system was equally extraordinary. Rome at its height had 11 major aqueducts delivering over 1 billion liters of water to the city every single day. 1 billion liters per day to a city of 1 million people. The Pont du Gard aqueduct in southern France, still standing, still structurally perfect after 2,000 years, carried 50,000 cubic meters of water per day across a 3-tier stone bridge 50 meters high. It was built without cement, without mortar, without metal clamps, purely through the precision fit of hand-cut stone blocks. The engineering precision required to maintain a gradient of just 34 centimeters per kilometer across 50 kilometers of terrain, using only hand tools and manual surveying equipment, is a feat that modern engineers describe as genuinely astonishing. This is what Rome did that Greece never did. Greece created ideas. Rome built infrastructure. Greece produced philosophy. Rome produced engineering. Greece asked, what should the ideal city be? Rome built a city with sewers that are still in use today. The Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer of Rome, constructed in the 6th century BC and continuously used for 2,600 years. You can take a boat tour of it today. It still drains rainwater from central Rome. No Greek city had anything comparable. The Roman Empire, at its maximum extent under Emperor Trajan, in 117 AD, covered 5.5 million square kilometers. It contained between 60 and 100 million people, approximately 1/4 of the entire human population of the Earth at that time. It stretched from Scotland to the Sahara, from Portugal to Iraq. Every person within those borders, regardless of origin, Syrian, Gaul, Egyptian, Spaniard, Greek, African, could potentially become a Roman citizen. Rome extended citizenship to conquered peoples in a way that Greece never did. Athens was notoriously restrictive about citizenship. You needed to be born to 2 Athenian citizen parents to qualify, and even Socrates' student and defender Pericles' own children were technically illegitimate because their mother was not Athenian. Rome, especially after the Edict of Caracalla in 212 AD, granted citizenship to virtually every free person within the empire. This was not altruism. It was administrative genius. Citizens paid taxes. Citizens could be drafted. Citizens had a stake in the empire's survival. By making everyone Roman, Rome created the largest loyalty base of any empire in history. But Rome was not without its darkness. And the darkness is important because it shows us the cost of this kind of power. Roman society was built on slavery. Estimates suggest that at the peak of the Roman Empire, between 3 and 4 million slaves lived in Italy alone, approximately 30 to 40% of the total Italian population. The Roman economy was fundamentally dependent on slave labor. The great latifundia, the vast agricultural estates that fed the empire, were worked almost entirely by slaves. The mines of Spain and Sardinia, which produced the silver that financed the Roman military, were worked by slaves in conditions so horrific that the average life expectancy of a mine slave was measured in months. The construction projects that make modern engineers gasp, the roads, the aqueducts, the amphitheaters, were built substantially by slave and prisoner of war labor. This was not unique to Rome. Greece also had slaves. Athens' silver mines at Laurion employed perhaps 20,000 slaves at peak operation, in conditions that were described even by ancient writers as unbearable. But Rome's scale was different. When Spartacus led his slave revolt in 73 BC, at its peak, he commanded an army of over 100,000 escaped slaves who defeated multiple Roman legions in open battle before finally being crushed. The aftermath was Rome's most visible act of terror. 6,000 crucified slaves lining the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, one every 30 meters for 200 kilometers. The message was not subtle, and it was entirely effective. There was no serious slave revolt in Italy for another century. Greek public culture, by contrast, was different in its form, if not always in its ethics. Greek civic festivals involved sacrifice, animals killed in honor of the gods, their meat distributed to the population as a form of communal feast. The scale was smaller, the violence more ritualized, the purpose more explicitly religious. The Great Panathenaic Festival in Athens involved the sacrifice of 100 oxen, a hecatomb, the meat of which was distributed to the entire citizen population. This was religion, social cohesion, and wealth redistribution simultaneously. The Greeks were also capable of extreme violence. Their treatment of defeated enemies, the enslavement of entire populations of conquered cities, the brutal colonization practices of the Hellenistic kingdoms. But the theatrical presentation of violence as entertainment was specifically Roman in its scale and its institutional permanence. Now we come to the question of philosophy and governance, perhaps the most important comparison of all, because this is where the intellectual DNA of the two civilizations most clearly separates. Greek public culture, by contrast, was different in its form, if not always in its ethics. Greek civic festivals involved sacrifice, animals killed in honor of the gods, their meat distributed to the population as a form of communal feast. The scale was smaller, the violence more ritualized, the purpose more explicitly religious. The Great Panathenaic Festival in Athens involved the sacrifice of 100 oxen, a hecatomb, the meat of which was distributed to the entire citizen population. This was religion, social cohesion, and wealth redistribution simultaneously. The Greeks were also capable of extreme violence. Their treatment of defeated enemies, the enslavement of entire populations of conquered cities, the brutal colonization practices of the Hellenistic kingdoms. But the theatrical presentation of violence as entertainment was specifically Roman in its scale and its institutional permanence. Now we come to the question of philosophy and governance, perhaps the most important comparison of all, because this is where the intellectual DNA of the two civilizations most clearly separates. The Romans were not interested in abstract metaphysics. They were interested in how to live well, how to govern effectively, how to endure suffering, how to face death. Stoicism, imported from Greece, became the dominant Roman philosophical school precisely because it was practical. It gave you tools, mental tools for managing adversity, fear, desire, grief. Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and philosopher, was fundamentally a synthesizer. He took Greek philosophical ideas and translated them into Latin, making them accessible to the Roman ruling class. But he added relatively little that was philosophically original. His real genius was rhetorical and political, not philosophical. Seneca, writing under the nightmare of Nero's reign, produced Stoic essays of genuine power and depth, but they were explicitly practical guides to psychological survival under tyranny, not explorations of fundamental truth. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, perhaps the most widely read philosophical text in human history, still selling hundreds of thousands of copies per year, is a private journal of a man trying to apply Stoic principles to the actual experience of governing an empire, dealing with grief, managing anger, facing death. It is profoundly moving. It is genuinely wise. But it is Greek philosophy applied by a Roman. The intellectual source code was Greek. The application was Roman. This brings us to the most important comparison of all, legacy. Because in the end, power must be measured not just by what you achieve while you exist, but by what you leave behind when you are gone. The Roman Empire in the West collapsed in 476 AD when the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, survived until 1453 AD, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks. That is nearly 1,000 years longer than the Western Empire. But even the Byzantine Empire's intellectual culture was predominantly Greek. The language of the Byzantine Empire was Greek. Its theology, its philosophy, its literature, all Greek. The Roman political shell contained Greek intellectual content to the very end. What did Rome leave behind? Roman law is perhaps the most enduring legacy. The legal concepts of innocent until proven guilty, the right to face your accuser, the distinction between public and private law, the concept of legal personhood for organizations, all Roman. Every legal system in continental Europe descends directly from Roman law. When Napoleon codified French law in 1804, he was explicitly building on Roman foundations. When the European Union was created, its legal architecture was Roman. The very word law in the Romance languages, ley in Spanish, loi in French, leg in Italian, comes from the Latin lex. Roman law is not historical trivia. It is the operating system of modern civilization in ways most people never think about. Rome also left Christianity, not in the sense of creating it. Christianity was born in a Roman province, among a Jewish population, inspired by a Jewish teacher. But Rome spread it. When Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in 312 AD and made it the official religion of the empire, he turned a persecuted Middle Eastern sect into the dominant religion of the Western world. The Catholic Church, the most powerful institution in European history for over 1,000 years, was structured on Roman administrative lines. Its hierarchy, pope, cardinals, bishops, priests, mirrors the Roman imperial hierarchy of emperor, praetorian prefects, provincial governors, local administrators. The Catholic Mass was conducted in Latin for 1,500 years, not because Jesus spoke Latin, but because Rome did. Christianity without Rome is unrecognizable. The Roman administrative and cultural framework transformed a regional religious movement into a global civilization-defining force. And yet, and this is the final point, the one that resolves the original question, all of these Roman legacies are themselves downstream from Greece. Roman law was built on Greek natural law theory, the Stoic idea that there are universal moral principles discoverable by reason, which Cicero synthesized into the Roman legal tradition. Roman Christianity was shaped by Greek philosophy. The Gospel of John begins with the Greek concept of the logos, divine reason. Christian theology was formulated in the language of Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy by church fathers educated in the Greek intellectual tradition. The Romance languages themselves are Latin, but Latin was a language deeply influenced by Greek, and Latin literature was self-consciously modeled on Greek predecessors. Virgil's Aeneid is explicitly modeled on Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. The very foundation text of Roman literary culture is an imitation of a Greek original. So we return to the question, Roman Empire versus Greek civilization. Which was more powerful? Here is the honest answer. They are not comparable in the way the question implies. They are two different kinds of power. Rome was superior in military power, administrative power, engineering power, legal power, and the sheer physical scale of what it built and controlled. At its peak, Rome governed more people, over a larger territory, with more stability, for longer than any previous empire in history. These are facts. They are impressive facts. They deserve full acknowledgement. But Greece was superior in intellectual power, philosophical power, cultural power, and, most importantly, generative power. The power to produce ideas that other civilizations adapt, and build upon. The power to shape human thought across centuries and millennia. The power not just to conquer territory, but to colonize minds. By this measure, Greek civilization is not merely the equal of Roman civilization. It is arguably its source code. You cannot separate what Rome became from what Greece created. Roman power, in its deepest foundations, was built on Greek ideas. The roads were Roman. The ideas that determined where to build them were Greek. There's a thought experiment that clarifies this. Imagine Rome never existed. The Mediterranean world would look different. The legal tradition would be different. The spread of Christianity would have been different or delayed. The roads of Europe would not exist. The administrative framework of the continent would have taken a different form. These are significant losses. The world without Rome would be genuinely, substantially different. Now, imagine Greece never existed. No democracy, no philosophy, no scientific method, no theater, no Olympic Games, no concept of the individual citizen with rights. No Socrates, no Plato, no Aristotle. No Alexander spreading Greek thought across the known world. No Stoicism for Rome's emperors to govern by. No Platonic framework for Christian theology to build on. No Homer for Virgil to imitate. No mathematical tradition for the Islamic world to preserve and the Renaissance to revive. The world without Greece is not merely different. It is unrecognizable. The entire intellectual tradition of Western civilization, and through colonialism and globalization of global civilization, does not exist in any form we would recognize. Rome without Greece is a military machine without an operating system, an empire without a philosophy, power without purpose. This is the final answer. Rome was more powerful in the way that a hammer is more powerful than a blueprint. It struck harder, it built more, it lasted longer in physical terms. But Greece drew the blueprint, and the blueprint is still being used, still being taught, still shaping how 3 billion people in the Western cultural tradition understand law, government, ethics, art, and the nature of reality. The blueprint is still active. 2,500 years after the death of Socrates, you're watching a video on a device designed using scientific principles that trace back to Greek natural philosophy. In a country governed by democratic principles that trace back to Athens, under a legal system that traces back to Rome, but whose foundations trace back to Greek moral philosophy. You are, in the most literal intellectual sense, a product of both empires simultaneously. You cannot choose between them. You're already made of both. And here is the question I want you to sit with tonight. If ancient Greece could conquer Rome through ideas rather than armies, if a defeated civilization could become more powerful than the one that defeated it, what does that tell us about the true nature of power in the modern world? What ideas today are quietly conquering the civilizations that think they are winning? Leave your answer below, because next time we're going somewhere even more unsettling, into the final days of Rome, when the greatest empire in history began to collapse not from outside attack, but from within, from the weight of its own size, its own corruption, its own success. The fall of Rome is not just ancient history. It is a warning. And next time, we're going to read that warning very carefully.